Europe is being haunted by Egypt. That's the relationship between the past of Egypt and European history, in that we've inherited all of these institutions and practices that we don't entirely understand. And there is a
Whoa.
sense in which the historical relationship is a haunting. We are being haunted by these people because we've almost taken over their culture in a way. So I think
But
that
we
part
don't
of,
have their religion.
yeah, we don't have their religion, so we're not doing it right. We're
We
doing it
don't have
way
the
wrong.
hardware. We have the software.
Exactly,
And
yes,
it's like, no, dude, this shit was written in ternary. This is
right,
binary, dude.
right,
It's like we're using decimal, dude. This is base 60. Of course, this
right,
shit doesn't compile.
exactly, exactly,
It's not to say it's not complete. We're
yeah,
just compiling with the wrong compiler.
exactly.
It's amazing when you say that, because in my first chat with Matthios, I think Durand said that philosophy is the end of religion, or marks the end of religion. And it's seen in the arts because the faith is the fuel of the arts,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
right? And you can see that handoff between the
yeah.
priest and the academic almost, or the philosopher.
It depends, but yes, yes, there's a relationship in some ways.
That's crazy. So what you've been up to? You
Not
gonna
a
take
whole
a
lot. I'm writing a book, so that's what I've been doing this morning.
right?
It's a novel,
Wow.
so that's it. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
It's not easy to do that. That's discipline.
I am trying something right now. I have a collaborator. I have a co-author. We're trying to write a sci-fi book, and I'm trying to do 2,500 words a day. It's actually really fun. So that's what I'm working on right now, is like a bunch of literary stuff. You
You
know.
ever see that Jerry Seinfeld way of committing to write?
No, I actually haven't seen that. No.
Yeah, so it's just a calendar, and
Huh.
he would make sure he wrote every day. He would put an X every time he wrote.
Huh.
And he would say, "I don't want to break the chain, so I have to write today."
That's great.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But it's
Yeah, it keeps you going. That perfectionism, it's the
I mean, it's funny because we're all on Twitter kind of co-publishing right now, and you can get lost in just kind of going in circles on it
yeah,
rather than just being like, okay.
yeah, putting it down now. Have to leave. Yeah, it's
10
all.
new, 10 new notifications. Fuck.
Yeah. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but like it saps my brain for me. Like, and then I can't think anymore. I'm just constantly wired and I can't take in new information. I'm just sort of like zapped out, like, oh, what's going on? Oh, someone's eating a kumquat. Oh, like, and you're fried. It's not
Look, that kumquat is an 8K now, though.
right. Yeah, right.
Right? So it's just like, um, no, it's not to say it's not to say I haven't found it productive.
Hmm. Right.
It's just there's a limit to
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Um, so I want to talk to you today about alchemy,
Yeah.
because I've been introduced to alchemy through different people in my life, and they had it in their life for completely different reasons,
Yeah. You mean
right?
like between them? Between them?
Yeah, like their use case for I almost said astrology because that's the only thing I can compare it to, right?
Okay. Yeah.
They
Yeah.
were looking at it. Some people look at that circular map and they see one thing.
Mm-hmm.
They see, what number should I play on the lottery?
Yeah, for sure.
Other people like Lil Shiva will look at that map and she'll see like, a lineage of thought
Right. Yeah.
that either started somewhere and spread or spontaneously arose from different places.
Yeah.
And we can assume that there was a connection, but not necessarily. Like
Right.
we were talking, like I asked you, so who's the Egyptian Euclid that wrote Euclid's Elements? And you said, no, it was a Egyptian Homer. Okay, well, what? Right? But, you know, some people look at Newton and say, well, he was doing proto chemistry. So that's one look at alchemy.
Yeah.
Other people are looking at the transmutation of their own soul.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? But, you know, I've talked to you long enough that you understand alchemy from a historical slice,
Well,
which I don't know.
it's not just historical. I mean, it is both of those things that the people you know are talking about. Or, I mean, I don't, the way I would say I understand alchemy is in a literary way. That's the principal way
Okay.
I understand it.
You
Like
got me.
that's why I'm interested in these books, right? The
Yeah, yeah.
novels, is that you can use it to tell stories. And not even use it. The stories themselves are alchemical. And that to me as a writer is really interesting as a literary form, you
The
know?
stories, because we talked before about this, and I was trying to track it, and you told me that the alchemical process, which I knew as like
Oh, yeah.
calcinatio
Yeah.
and all of these
Yeah.
kind of pseudo Latin phrases, right? There was this whole process there.
Yeah.
Then you talked to me about the 12 gates, right? And then you connected it somehow with the funeral rites. I'm getting to get it wrong, but just to kind of outline where our thoughts were, it was funeral preparatory rites to get to the other side in an anti-fragile way. I don't know.
Yeah. It's hard to understand. Yeah.
So maybe you can walk that backwards through me because I don't even know if I tracked it right, but that's why I wanted to talk to you because I was like, oh, I didn't know this. Uh,
Well,
yeah.
that's my interpretation. That's not
Let's
a
just
common.
no. Let's assume your interpretation is absolutely right for the purposes of this.
Right. Okay. Yeah. For the purposes of this video. Yeah.
You'll never say anything wrong for this.
Right. Right.
Okay.
Yes. Just listen.
Yeah,
No.
couch to paribus. Yeah.
Here we go.
Yeah.
No. No. These Egyptologists,
Mm-hmm.
a couple of them like Eric Hornung and Jan Asman, were talking about the Book of Gates as containing Hermetic symbolism. And there's always been a sort of a complicated relationship in that field now that we can read the hieroglyphic texts between to what extent is the new, because it's really very old, the Egyptian literature we're reading now, to what extent is it related to the Hermetic literature?
What do you mean when you say hermetic or hermeticism?
Okay, I'm just going to pick up a bunch of books that I have right here.
Yeah, yeah.
This is what I mean when I talk about Hermeticism. This is a translation by Brian P. Copenhaver. I don't know if you can see that. Of ancient texts from late antiquity Egypt. They come down to us in Greek. So this was after Egypt was colonized by Greece. And then it was colonized by Rome. First, it was colonized.
What year are we talking? This is Alexander.
Alexandrian, yeah, Alexandrian period, yeah. So around that time.
What year? What year is that?
It started in around 330 BC, I think, is around the time Alexander the Great invaded the Persian Empire. When he conquered the Persian Empire, he also conquered Egypt, and he styled himself as the liberator of Egypt. And then he started a lineage of kings. After he died, his empire fragmented. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt for a number of generations. And then the final one, who we all know, is Cleopatra. And then the Romans ruled. And that's the story.
Now, just to kind of place this, before Alexander was conquering, were Persians conquering?
Yes.
Right.
And that led to a particularly interesting political situation. Well, yeah, I can give you the history right now because it's a process.
Right.
First, was the quality getting bad for a second?
No, no, no. I was looking to make sure it was recording. You can tell I sat on my glasses.
Right.
And so now I was supposed to get contacts, and now I have to go for an eye exam. Imagine what that's like,
Right.
right? As we're in the tornado of the second wave.
Yeah.
So as we started talking, I tried to put my glasses back on to make sure the thing.
Oh no.
So it's one of those things where to check if it's a recording. It's a bit more of a task because I have these on now. So when I tried to put it on, I tried to squeeze with the ear things.
Oh, that's
So
okay.
it's okay. It's just one of those things where it couldn't be more Egyptology than glasses breaking.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, right.
So I like it. It goes.
Yeah, okay.
It's on tone. Let's say.
Okay. All
So
right.
the Persians were, because imagine my entire history is a mix of Will Durant, falling asleep to Will Durant, and hardcore history episodes.
Okay.
Okay,
All right.
so that's just
All right. Okay. Well, we'll start from there. Hey, that's a great way to get it though. Welcome to the global village. I'll try
That's
to
where I'm starting. Yeah.
I'll try to compress it really shortly because a lot of people actually just don't know because no one really reads Egyptian history, even though we know it now. It's about 3,000 years. The pyramids were built. There was a period of, a sort of a golden age. The country went.
And when you say what year are we talking about? Like, I want to really
Okay, so 5,000 years ago, the pyramids were built.
5,000 years ago. Okay.
So 5,000 years ago, the pyramids were built. This was sort of the beginning of Egypt as a country. There was a bit of history before that, but this is the first full flowering of Egyptian culture. Then there was sort of a gradual decline. The nobles gained too much power, and the country fragmented into chaos, and there were a bunch of competing groups. Eventually, it re-emerged in the reign of a very famous king called Amenemhat I.
What year is that?
That's about 4,000 years ago. About 4,000 years ago.
Okay, yeah, gotcha.
That happened. And then, so it's like 1,000 years, roughly, between the start of Egypt. The pyramids were built about 500 years into that. And then
So we have a resurgence.
Yeah, there's a resurgence. And this creates the first flowering of Egyptian literature. This lasts for about 500 years after that.
Mm-hmm.
And then invaders come from Canaan called the Hyksos. Mm-hmm. They invade, and these invaders there's a reign of terror as they rule Egypt, and Egypt sort of never really recovers from this event. Some of the events that are talked about in Exodus are sort of a confabulation of the chaos that happened, and when Egypt comes back, it comes back in a very different cultural guise, much more outward looking than it was before, looking to be an empire.
What year would Exodus pick up the story?
That's a controversial question because, there's no evidence of Moses existing from the Egyptian records.
Yeah, but we don't even know Shakespeare exists. So
well, yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's probably.
Mark Twain says hi.
Right. Yeah, for sure. It was Francis Bacon. But yeah, I think it was around, probably around the reign of Ramses is what this Bible says. It says it's the reign of Ramses II, who was the most famous pharaoh at that time,
and reign of Ramses would have been what
3,000 years ago, about 3,000.
So 3,000.
Yeah, so we're dealing. It started 5,000 years ago, and it's 4,000, it's 3,000. These are really long time scales.
Yeah, I'm not even sure if you can see this. It's probably flipped the wrong way, but I'm just kind of tracking this.
Yeah.
As a time, right?
Yeah.
So we have Exodus movement of people at 3,000 BC.
Yeah.
And okay, Reign of Ramses. So what's happening with the Reign of Ramses?
Well, what happened was there was a competition between the priesthood of Amun, who'd taken over control of the country, and
priesthood of Amun. Interesting.
They were the priesthood of Thebes, and when the Hyksos were repelled, the priesthood of Amun were the ones who actually took over sort of the running of the country, which they hadn't before. It's
Hmm.
Hyksos. I always pronounce it wrong. Yeah. So just so you know, I've been sounding like a total idiot. I have dyslexia associated with this word. It's Hyksos, not Hiskos, whatever. Um,
Yes.
anyways, so this group was repelled. The priesthood of Amun seized control over Egypt, and then there's a power struggle. Akhenaten, the king we've all heard of, he's the one who emerges, right? That he emerges out of this. Okay, that's
What
sort of where the story of
what
Moses is
year?
born out of. Oh God, I don't know. Around a little like around 1200, 1300 BC, somewhere around
Okay,
there.
so now we're at 1200. So fast
It's
forward.
still it's still about 3,000 years ago. It's before Christ. This is a long history. I'm trying to make it simple. It's complicated.
Yeah, no, no, no.
Um,
It's it's interesting because people often, like my professor, he taught me that we often think about things without a regard to competition.
hmm
And when you're talking about a lot of these events, they're competition led and competition driven, right?
Yeah,
With the Hyksos and these outside forces. And
yeah, yeah. It's complicated because we also have an image of the past of people like not associating with each other. But if you look at that world, they were all writing letters. They were incredibly well connected from, even from as far afield as India to, the interior of Africa. These people were all connected with each other. So there was a big conversation going on, sort of like telephone. But anyways, the story goes after Akhenaten's rebellion,
hmm
the state was never the same again. He was a brutal dictator. The fact that we glorify him in our society is really a historical anachronism. He was a dictator who ran the place into the ground, and the country never recovered. Ramses II came along and made Egypt great again, but it was the beginning already. The wheels had been set in motion for decline, and the priesthood of Amun created a theocracy in the south of the country, and Libyans ruled the north of the country. Is what happened.
is this just an oscillation between state and the church ruling
No, because the church was the state.
throughout this whole time?
Yeah, throughout this whole time, the priesthood of Amun taking control and setting themselves up as king was a major breakdown in the system.
3000 BCE. We're
Uh,
talking. No,
1000, after like 900 BC, like this.
900, 900 BCE.
Yeah,
We
something.
have the priesthood of Amun, which are Theban,
Yeah, they're based in Thebes. Yeah,
based in Thebes.
yeah. Um,
Hmm.
we have a. Let me see. Yeah, I'm just looking for a timeline.
So hold on, like what you're saying is that you have Egypt declining into Rome's incline?
It's there's a long story of about 1,000 years of decline after this. So
Okay, so I'm just thinking about waves of like, because I often thought very simply of Egypt's decline and, you know what I mean? Like this.
yeah,
And is that true? I don't know. That's just my simple binary way of understanding
I
history.
don't know. Maybe it took a long time, right? Took a long it the last hieroglyphic inscriptions were only written like 1,500 years ago. So
Okay, yeah.
within the time of Christ.
It takes a lot of time to topple over a vending machine, they say.
Right. Yeah. Especially a 3,000-year-old one. Yeah. I'm sure they say that too. Uh,
And that's why it's funny. The first pyramids, I'm not sure if people know this, were rectangular in shape.
yeah. Right. Yes. There you go. Yeah.
So no, okay. So that's interesting. So the church and the state were intertwined the entire time.
Yeah, here's a really great way. If you want to understand what it's like basically you're ruled by the church all the time, and Jesus is always alive and he's always king. That's what it's like. The king is Jesus is always here.
Jesus walks.
Yeah, Jesus. You know, you can. The king is Jesus. That's the state religion, basically, and that continues.
It's not. It comes down. No, it's this guy.
Yeah, it's there. It's present in the world. You know, the king is the logos. So that's the way to. That's what how we would understand it.
Okay. So I think this is a good place then. Why was the funeral rites of this walking Jesus so important to them?
Well, you know, the soul of the king maintained the harmony of the state through his magical presence and through his divine sincerity. So by ensuring that his death originally, you know, when the kings died, and this is a common ritual practiced all over the world, they would be buried alive. This ritual was practiced in China, in Europe. I don't know if it was practiced in India, but it was. This is a ritual from all over the world, and it was practiced in Egypt too, where the king would be buried alive with all of his courtiers, and not only would the king be killed ritually for the state, everyone else would be. So the pyramid was sort of a way. The original building of pyramids was a way to do that symbolically without having to literally kill the king, in much the same way that Christ's sacrifice on the cross means that we're able to partake of a symbolic sacrifice rather than literally performing a ritual animal slaughter every Sunday. That's what, you know, it's actually is, it's a very similar logic to communion is the logic of the pyramid, actually. So that is why you want to make sure the spells are being performed correctly, because the death of the king is the sacrament which creates the union of heaven and earth.
The soul of the king has a physical effect on the health of the state.
It has to do with the idea of ma'at and isfet, which
What's
are the
that?
word. Ma'at is the concept of truth or justice, and isfet is the concept of chaos. And so truth and justice are one. Moral truth and sincerity are things that must be practiced both with the word and they say with the arm in action, and also within thought itself. And by performing ma'at in this way, it is held that the state will be orderly, officials will be just, they will not, you know, be corrupt, they will perform their roles correctly, and everyone will be in harmony with each other. So that's what it represents.
You ever read Troilus and Cressida?
No, I actually haven't.
Okay, you know what it's about?
No, tell me.
Okay, so it's Shakespeare. It's about the Trojan War.
Yeah.
And Ulysses, Odysseus, is talking to all the other Greek leaders, and they're trying to figure out, hey, why aren't we winning? Why do we suck so bad? I thought we were better than this. And he goes through a whole solar system, and he says, if the sun's fucked up, everything falls apart.
Right.
He says at the end of it, Troy in our weakness stands. It's us.
Right.
How are our soldiers supposed to act?
Right.
If their heads are sick.
Right.
That's not the way the body works, and that's not the way the solar system works. And right? He said, like, degree unvisited, all this shit falls apart, and it's really crazy. But it's the idea that the state is only as healthy as the leadership.
Right. Yeah.
And this belief is coded in religion.
Right.
I guess we still
Yeah.
pray to become a president.
Yeah, there is a kind of subconscious state religion with how we, especially these days, it wasn't quite as true a few generations ago, but these days, the president is almost a divine object, who's voted into office.
That's because North America needs a savior.
No, that's how people feel, definitely. But it wasn't intended by that, I think, by the people who set up the system. They thought that the most rational person, at least I imagine they would have thought, given who they were, that the most rational person should have gotten the job. These days, we do tend to view it in terms of personality, you know?
It's interesting because regardless of why they were fighting, they had an existential reason for it.
Right.
Underlying whatever, if they wanted to use Kant's pure reason or if they want to swear on a Bible, right? They had
Right.
an existential reason for fighting. Like I always think about, you ever see the fight with Tyson? Was it Tyson Fury?
I haven't seen that one, no.
Okay, because he gets like clobbered in like almost the last round, and he almost gets counted out, and he stands up, and he actually ends up like fighting back, and it's like a lot of people will not listen to the part of the interview where he says it was because of Jesus, because
Right.
that doesn't really fit in with a lot of people's boxing analysis.
Right.
Right? They want it to be about the incline and the jab.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's weird because it's like, whether or not you believe it doesn't mean they weren't devout.
Right. For sure.
Right? And you opened up my eyes to the fact that we look at Egypt through our cultural lens. And so the reason I'm asking you these questions is I don't want to overlay my cultural lens on what this actually is.
Yeah.
So going back, so the soul of the king is the health of the state. Therefore, if we steward the soul of the king post breath stop, that will lead into a good transition, because what could be more fragile for a state than the moment of succession? Just ask Genghis Khan, right?
You actually are now overlaying things.
Tell me, yeah.
So
That's good.
what it is that the function of the state is to participate in cosmic order. It's not just a secular thing. The world is suffused with gods. The world is suffused with energies and personalities. And the role of the king is really to perform ritual that sustains the actual course of the cosmos. So the state is not separate from the cosmos, and the king has a vital responsibility to be the intermediary between the human world and the divine world. So the king has a vital responsibility to do this. And if that's not performed correctly, of course, there are going to be problems in the state, because the harmony that is inherent in nature and in reality, in higher cosmic reality, will not be within the state. And so this is why we have so many problems understanding them, is because we live in fundamentally a metaphysically different
Yeah.
We do not live in that world. There are still some societies around who live in that world, but in the West, we have lost touch with that world.
Is the question, how might we maintain unity with the cosmic world here on Earth? Is that what they're asking themselves?
Well, it's sort of like the idea that the transcendent reality, which underlies the numinous images of the world, has to be performed into existence and made evident by ritual. So the role of a ritual is to take it can have many roles, but it is an act in and of itself which takes the transcendent and the immanent and unites them, or takes the other world and this world and brings them into contact and makes them whole again and reconsecrates them. which is that there are, of course, similarities with the discipline of alchemy in this, of course, but
Mm,
the similarity of alchemy to many other, uh, theurgic or spiritual or ritual systems as ways of looking at the world it's very common, But in this case, there does happen to be a kind of a link with Egypt, as we're now uncovering more of recently.
so we have, you said, a transcendental reality.
Well, you have to think about the glyphs. The hieroglyphs are the best way, I think,
Okay,
to
okay.
understand them, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Their writing system is basically, the magically effective forms of what is spoken of, which combine at the same time both spoken content and also an imagistic ideal content. And these two elements are interwoven in a way that you can't have one without the other.
Right.
So when you speak about something, you're magically invoking it. Well, especially when you write about something, not necessarily just when you speak. Hakao is their concept of an invocation, which is very different. We translate this as magic, but magic is a very poor translation of what this is. Um, our concept of magic is a shadow of what the world that they lived in, basically.
Really?
Yes.
Because in my head, I'm thinking invoked like you cast.
It is. It is like you cast, yes, but they are participating. They are so deeply embedded in participation. Participation mystique is the French. There was a French phrase the anthropologists of the last century used to use to describe this mystic participation with the cosmos and with the forms of the cosmos.
Oh, wow. Mystic participation with the cosmos.
There was not a boundary between self and other in the same way, and they held the forms of the cosmos sacred at the same time as they were in worship of a transcendent God.
So they didn't think about their self and other the same way?
Well, that's a 20th century viewpoint about participation mystique, that the boundaries between the ego and the world, or the ego and God, were different. Um, I think that maybe at that time they had a tendency to psychologize these things, to talk about them in terms of psychology, and these days we're moving into a new era. It's not quite clear where we're going, but that the relationship that these people had to the world and to their own souls, and by that, through that relationship to God, was different than our relationship currently. We have a different way in which our subjectivity is conceived, that we have created culturally and culturally structured it, just as much as they culturally created and culturally structured sets of rituals to bring themselves in alignment with the rhythms of the cosmos, and to create ways for the divine to be embodied in forms in the world. Some of those would be in the forms of icons, like in certain Christian sects we still have today,
Mm-hmm.
right? And some of that would be in the form also of the glyphs themselves,
Right.
which represent ideal versions of what's spoken of.
Wow. Okay, I have some questions for you. I have to grab a drink. I'm
Yeah.
dying. But this is what I wrote. 1 sec.
Okay.
So thirsty.
Yeah, no worries. Might as well,
So good. Oh, great. Okay. So, that I have here. It's interesting when you talk about how might we be in a court, did they have a conception of the DAO? Like, did they think about it in
Well,
that way?
um, that's that's complicated. First of all, if you were to talk about the way Confucius uses the word Tao, I would say you would translate that as Ma'at, the word I was just talking about for cosmic.
Right.
That's sort of the way Confucius uses the word Tao. If you would talk about the way Lao Tzu uses the word Tao, then we're talking about a cosmic principle. And that is very different. I think in that case, there would be a number of different deities who at different times in Egyptian history would be emblematic of that principle, such as Atum.
You know, like with Hinduism, how you have Hinduism with the pantheon, and
Yeah,
then you have Hinduism Advaita,
yeah,
which is just nothing,
yeah, yeah,
nothing. There's
totally.
no one.
Yeah, yeah.
Does Egyptian religion have that smaller wayward sect of like
Um,
anti personification?
the um, okay. The easy answer is well, it's not quite no. It's not
Hmm.
quite. It's That's not quite a no. There are many similarities between Hinduism and Egyptian religion, and especially in the past 200 years, people have been drawing a lot of comparisons, but they're not exact. There are some minor differences. I mean, we are talking about two different countries, but
Hmm.
one, I suppose, what I would say is that you have on the one hand the official state religion of the deities, where they talk about the gods are spoken of in theurgic or ritualistic form. They're given the forms of images and all of these things. And then you also have the religion of the philosophers, which is the Sebayat, where they only talk about God in a singular sense.
Mm.
And if you read the Sebayat, they tend to be moral prescriptions for how to act, similar to the Analects of Confucius. So it's different than the official state religion, and there were many different forms of the official state religion. There are different gods in every town and village and city, and all of these things. So that was the spiritual discipline of the sages who tended to know hieroglyphs and were holding a very high position within the state and had a very specific, like they had their own understanding of what's going on. I think that the understanding of, the forms of God at the same time representing something that transcends form, you would find that throughout basically all levels of Egyptian religion. I don't think that was.
I'm trying to anchor myself around this point that the health of the state is linked to the health of uh, their Jesus King on earth,
Yeah, yeah,
and that ritual is the way that they preserve order.
yes, yes,
And then, if we know that ritual is the way they preserve order, now we're going back to the funeral ceremony. Now, before we leave the funeral ceremony, uh, I want to, I essentially want to talk about the connection between the funeral ceremony and this alchemical terminology,
yeah,
right? So
yeah,
I don't know where to start with that, but rites is the funeral rites are all over the documentaries, right?
yeah.
They did this and they pulled out the brain through the nose and
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Well,
right.
that's mummification, which definitely appeals to the sort of the morbid side of our imagination, and that's how we see Egypt, is in this kind of morbid way.
Yeah,
But that's not really
sounds
that's
like a COVID test.
right. Exactly. Yeah. Pull your brain out the nose. Yeah. Look at that. You have the virus. No, it's not exactly the same because
What did you say? I can't understand what you're saying. You took away the language part of my brain.
oh,
Yeah.
it's gone. Yeah, you've been infected, Mike. Um, What we were talking? Yeah, it's complicated. It's complicated. That's the answer. The There's also a process that occurs in Egyptian history. I've been talking about it as if it's a monolithic thing, but there is a long that those 3,000 years of sometimes periods of renaissance and sometimes periods of decline. There was a long and slow transformation that began to happen in that country, which you can
Huh?
generalize as the gods started receding from the world. They became more distant. And as they became more distant, the function of the official religion began to change. Things that used to be reserved only for the king began to be extended more and more until eventually all regular people could be doing them, right? And
Now, in the back of my head, this is what I want to talk to you about. Does this track towards, this may be a spurious correlation, um, what Luther was doing in like Munster, where, and I see the same thing with Greek religions where you have Hestia in the beginning because you need fire. But as soon as they're conquering, fuck Hestia, we need Athena and Ares. And you just see it's almost like the gods are a function, the gods' prominence in the society is a function of how the society needs a certain role to be almost, right? And
well,
and then once you have people because maybe it's a function of people becoming more literate.
well, literacy is definitely tied to the process in a very mysterious way.
Really?
Oh
Okay.
yeah, but that's something that I that's too big, I think, for us to talk about.
Really?
But that, I mean, that has to do with, you can, because I mean, I'm a linguist, so you can see
Oh,
this
I
in.
didn't know that. I don't even know your back. What is your background?
I have an MA in linguistics.
Oh, okay.
I've been playing with hieroglyphs recently for an art project, but
Okay.
I do have a degree in linguistics technically.
Huh.
Um,
Why'd you do
Really,
that?
I'm a writer. Okay, because I wanted to understand language scientifically, right? I wanted to understand it in a technical sense, and that's what studying linguistics lets you do. You can look at the scientific and the mathematical way of how words and meanings are put together on different, levels of organization. So
Oh, wow. It's almost like I would compare that to like the scientific study of the music of language
yeah, it's sort of
and
like,
how people create jazz together when they talk and what
yeah,
meanings they get from things.
yeah. There's a field of linguistics called pragmatics actually dedicated to that. Yeah,
Okay, because I remember a story about, I think it's with, I forget the jazz trumpeter, but the key the piano player is telling the story about how he makes a mistake on the keyboard,
yeah,
and the jazz, I think it was Miles Davis, was so tuned in that he changed what he was playing to accommodate the mistake.
yeah.
And he was like, "Oh shit, this guy's so in tune. When I made a mistake, he improvised with it.
Right.
He
Yeah,
didn't treat it as a mistake or look at me sideways."
yeah, yeah, for sure.
And those kind of like, when you think about chord progressions,
Yeah,
that's like that's like drawing lines on a paper. Okay, we're going to write sentences using these lines, and the lines look like this,
yeah,
right? And if you, to sound important or for us to keep talking, right? And different people have different degrees of freedom of how much language they want to use in a given sentence.
right, right.
For a lot
It's
of people, they
very,
would find it very discordant to have a lot of language used. For other people, it's music. For other people, it's not.
it's very similar actually. It's very, that you can draw a real line, a line between it. Probably, especially in the area where mathematics intersects with all of these things. That's probably our biggest link there.
Yeah, well, I thought a lot about the callback libeler diversions
Hmm.
a few years ago via John Baez,
Mm-hmm.
right? And he has this lecture called The Biology of Information Dynamics.
Sounds interesting.
And I've watched the first 10 minutes. And a few seconds I remember, he says, what the learner learns is a function of what they already know.
Huh.
And it seems small,
Yeah.
but it's a complete reframing of how you might communicate something.
It sounds like Plato, honestly. I was just reading the
Tell me.
yesterday. It's the same. He says the same thing, actually.
Really?
Socrates does, yes.
What does he say?
Oh, he says that everything that we learn is something we already remembered before, you know.
I don't know.
Which
I
actually,
can't.
that does go back.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's something that our soul, because the soul is immortal, we're remembering something that we knew before we were alive when we learn it. He uses geometry to demonstrate this, to say, geometry is an eternal form, and he takes a servant boy who had never learned math before, and he demonstrates a basic proof
What book is
about it.
this?
It's the Meno. It's one of Plato's dialogues. It's
Meno.
yeah,
That's amazing.
yeah. They called the concept anamnesis. It's probably another one I'll mispronounce.
Mesos. No, everything. By the way, everything you pronounced during this episode is correct.
Right.
It's actually the new standard of how you say
right.
things.
There we go. Yes. Welcome to the internet. Yeah. People chatting at loud volumes about things they're misinformed.
Yeah. Hey, look. If the president can do it.
Right. There you go. No, but that is actually connected to the question about the gods receding to the world in some way, receding from the world, because Plutarch talks about this later on, about 1,000 years after Alexander conquered Egypt.
Okay.
He mentions that the oracles, oracles became common in Egypt in the New Kingdom period. 2,000 years later, Plutarch was mentioning the oracles were drying up, the voices. Like, the oracle at Delphi is one of the most famous ones. She's the priestess of Apollo. She prophesies, and there's a list of the famous predictions that she gave correctly. In Egyptian history, before there were oracles, you didn't even need oracles because the king was the direct intermediary between the human world and the world of the gods. But as the gods started receding, or really as we receded from the gods, that gap became wider and oracles came up to fill that gap. Then the oracles started dying at the beginning of the Christian period, and the church arose to fill that gap. And now the church is dying, and what's going to rise up to fill? We're still sort of going backwards away from it, and that we are at the tail end of that process now. So
who might we pass the buck to?
Yeah, right. Yeah. How much longer can we kick this can down the road? Here's an ecological catastrophe, children, because that's where we're going,
This ecological tragedy brought to you by not following step 11.3 of the 12-step gate process.
Right, there you go. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. You just
Sorry again.
Nothing.
Yeah. I remember, you ever go sit in like a puja, when the right, and when you have like the sweets, the prasad and stuff like that, the right with the fruit. I remember a lady saying, don't eat the prasad that's by the altar, because if you do, in your next life, you're gonna be come back dark skinned.
Oh God. Oh, that's awful. Oh.
And I'm like, there are some ancient traditions.
Yeah.
It's just so like
Bad.
it's so interesting. You don't know how these things get passed down, right?
Colorism wasn't quite as much of a thing before the British invaded, though. That's what I mean, people say a lot of things, People say things about the Mughals, too, that, like, caste was a beautiful thing in Sri Ram's time. And, so it can be tough to tell at times. But I've heard colorism is, like, big product of the British Empire.
Yeah, I remember an Uber driver told me that there was like a lot of false flag operations and shit, right, during that, for the divide and rule.
Oh yeah, for sure. Oh
like,
yeah.
like he was telling me about how they would like throw pork on like Muslim temples and blame it in Hindus and shit, and it's like,
no, they deliberately, yes. They did a
right?
lot. They did so many bad things. It's insane. It's actually, like, if you read the history of how they did it, it sort of doesn't make sense, because obviously they didn't write down all the dirty shit they did. So you can't
There's
like,
no ledger.
there's no ledger. They left no paper trail, right? But you can't tell how on earth did this tiny little country, England, manage to dominate this giant ancient continent? It shouldn't have worked, but it did. And they did it because they played so dirty and they were so conniving, is really, that's the only answer, you know?
I think the inverse answer is that the inverse answer someone might give is that the people didn't like each other before that.
That is also true. Yes.
Now, I don't even know if that's right. Right? I'm just saying, if I were to take the inverse, right?
Yeah.
And I say this because in a lot of places other than the US, there are elections. And in some places in the world, like especially in the Caribbean, sometimes it's people who are black, it's people who are black versus people who are brown.
Yeah.
You know, and you don't know if is it just these people didn't like each other before this?
Yeah.
And the election somehow gives them cover to make statements they might not make in 3 years ago. It doesn't make sense. And
Yeah.
it's
hard to tell. Yeah. I mean, especially if we're talking about India in particular, you know, there's, I mean, just like you were talking about, just like Hindu-Muslim relations, that's an incredibly long and sad history. Yet at the beginning of the British era, you have, like right before the British took over, you have someone like Akbar, who was a Mughal emperor who took great pains to actually try to unite Muslims and Hindus. He was a Muslim. And the Muslims, the whole thing started because the Muslims were very intolerant of Hinduism. They didn't know how to handle it. You know, Islam was a great system for a Zoroastrian country like Persia, or Christian countries like Egypt and Syria. It could deal with the Jews. It had no problem with countries that were already basically monotheist. But when Islam encountered a very rich country that was functionally polytheist, that's the clash. Islam is sort of like an operating system that runs on top of Christianity and Zoroastrianism, right? You know, it needs that base to work. It can't just go to a place that's pagan and do it. It needs the, you know, it needs the earlier firmware.
yeah, let alone a fabric of paganism.
Right.
Because people think Hinduism, that's just a blanket for something we call happening within a subcontinent, which doesn't even have the same food depending on how far you go.
Yes. Yeah.
Let alone the same language, let alone the same complexion, let alone the same, you know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So we were supposed to talk about alchemy.
Yeah.
So, but going back, the root was, though, you told me that there was a connection between calcinatio and all of that language.
Well, I mean, it's not a direct connection. It's
okay, yeah.
It's elliptical. It's fun. If you look at Ripley's 12 Gates, you know, that's a poem that describes all of those.
Ripley's 12 Gates.
Yeah, okay. So George Ripley, he was an English alchemist. And you can read the 12 alchemical stages. And if you look at the Book of Gates, which describes the sun going through the netherworld, we're also reading about 12 gates, which correspond to the 12 hours. There's a lot of esoteric significance here with the calendar, but the principal link between the rhythm, if you read the Tabulus Margidina, the Emerald Tablet of Hermes, which is a document that we found in Arabic, probably goes back to the Greek, and emerges from Alexandria during this time we call the Interpretatio Graeca, where the Greeks are interpreting Egyptian religion in their own terms.
Say that again?
Sorry, it's a Latin phrase.
Yeah.
Interpretatio Graeca. It means the Greek interpretation, the interpretation of the Greeks.
Like the St. Augustine trying to understand Plato and Christianity?
That comes a little bit later.
But that idea of a marriage, like...
So yeah, sort of like that. It's like where, you know, like the Greeks identified Hermes with Thoth, right? They said the god Hermes and the god Thoth are the same. And in Egypt, they did this based on a tradition that they didn't fully understand, but it was an Egyptian tradition of identifying gods with each other, like Amun Ra. Amun was identified with Ra, which was the principal form with which that priesthood justified their power. And they did achieve just almost unparalleled power of a single deity dominating the pantheon in the later years of Egypt, which was different than some of the things that were happening before. I mean, it was a different kind of religion that was emerging in those times. Or a slightly different variation, like I was talking about also at the same time, the oracles start emerging. So you can see the human world and the divine world are drifting further apart. But with alchemy, there's this idea that, especially later on, these funerary spells that the king is performing are also a form of the same rituals that the king is meant to perform to keep the sun in its course going across the sky. This is part of the fundamental function of Ma'at, is to maintain the orbit of the sun. So when Hermes Trismegistus, who is the Greekified version of the god Thoth, talks about in the Emerald Tablet that my doctrine on the revolutions of Sol is completed, he's talking about revolutions of the sun in the same way that these esoteric texts from Egypt were talking about revolutions of the sun. And these esoteric spells were put into a language of metallurgy that already existed independently in Egypt, and these two things were combined.
If and when a god king, Jesus, passed away in Egypt,
yeah,
did that happen because of something in another realm?
That's a question that I think is impossible to answer.
No. If I was Egyptian,
yeah, I mean, because
how did I conceive of it? Yeah,
I understand you. It's just that if they would not have necessarily made a direct distinction between this realm and another realm. I mean, there were other worlds, but like causally, I'm not even sure people would even make that distinction, right? The gods are, if you're living in the world where the gods are apparent in every single action that takes place, there's no way the death of the king is going to be interpreted in an infinite variety, but the death of the king does have very specific ritual meaning. And there might be certain priests who would receive dreams from certain gods that would tell you why that happened. But there are also stories, even from the time of King Amenemhat, he was killed in a conspiracy. This is part of the issue with Ma'at and Isfet. There is Isfet coming up and eradicating the king. Disorder is always threatening to overtake order. So this is a situation where boundaries that we would make between the secular and the sacred don't exist to them. They understand what is happening there in simultaneously, magical and religious terms, and also terms that we would hold as separate from those things. It's unified in their world.
And it's interesting because it's, if somebody were to look back at the Bible versus what people actually believed, they'd be like, hold on, they believe that, but they read this. Right. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's almost like you're like what you pointed out was like there was a philosopher king religion.
Yes.
But then there's a colloquial retail religion. Sorry.
Yeah, well, yeah. There is a sort of, even though Egyptologists have tried to play down recently this idea that the Egyptian religion has two faces and there's a secret religion for the elite and for the masses, there is a certain differentiation between people who can write and people who can't. There is a differentiation there, and the people who write have different spiritual traditions than the people who can't. Maybe not different spiritual traditions, because you could also say the Sebiat were meant to be read aloud. So we don't actually know that this was like a certain thing that was kept in secret and only the people who read would keep it from the masses. Generally, if you look at how the state was set up, being a scribe was a very important role, but it's not necessarily that that would be hoarded away from the people. There's definitely a lot of evidence that says that actually um, these teachings were common even among those who could not read and write.
Mm.
But there are things that the philosophers were going to keep to themselves, probably, So that is the case. It's complicated. There was a separation of powers as well between the scribes, the royal throne, and the army. That was the separation of the three systems of government.
It's through this conversation I realize sometimes, just in the same way that I make fun of people for looking at Hinduism as all of India, it's the same way of kind of looking at Egypt as one thing.
Yep.
No, it existed for a few thousand years,
Yep.
and if you looked at what people thought 100 years ago for us,
Yeah. Yes.
versus today,
Exactly.
who's to say, with this oscillation of church and state and pantheon versus oracle and
Yeah.
competition, what was important to that generation?
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. You see so much change over a very long period of time. And that's something that, especially in our society where we're so concerned with like the present moment, and people have trouble imagining like the coronavirus ever ending because it's the first time we've had to think of beyond, the next quarter. Trying to imagine this kind of society from that perspective is almost impossible,
And it's funny because we're almost managing it like it's the stock market. Hey, should we go outside? I don't know. Let's check stock market. Oh, it's green. That means go.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Basically, that has been the mediated response to the pandemic. It's insane. Yeah.
It's like people aren't getting sick. That means we should go outside and have a concert. I mean, that honestly, like, I'm not sure how it is where you are right now, but I'm in Toronto, and they're facing uh, this dichotomy where they're pulling back on all social gatherings.
Mm-hmm.
Still school though.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right, and it's kind of but it's Saturday, so there's still a
Yeah.
couple of days till Monday, right? But we're
Yeah.
now seeing a spike here, so who knows?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What's it like where you are?
The same. It's basically the same. We obviously aren't listening to Boris quite as much. I saw, Johnson did his thing, and then I think, what was it, a week later, Canada did his. So we are not,
Yeah, it's the policy brain drain. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. You can see the lines of force, but here, no, we're not doing that. We're a free country in America, so far be it from us. But to have a discipline there, but we are sending the kids back to school, and I just think it's just unconscionable. I mean, what kind of society is this that wants to protect the adults but put the children in danger, all for the purpose of profit? It applies to the universities too. I think, like, obviously it's a big economic problem, yes, but honestly, I think that if we could have the stomach or the balls or whatever it is to take the hit now and deal with the economic fallout all at once rather than trying to pretend this is not happening, I think that we would be in a better position. Personally, that's what like, okay, closing the universities is going to cause a major economic problem, but let's just do that for a year, have our major economic problem, rather than have a disorganized pandemic response that's going to lead to this, like, a bigger problem for 5 years rather than an intense problem for 1 year. But again, because we have a society that has encouraged even the elites, even educated people, to only think in terms of the next quarter, we are not able to handle even a 5-year problem, which is, I think it's sad, I think it's sad.
Well, I mean, at the same time, you're about to solve a 5-year problem in the U.S.,
Well, which
right?
one?
With
What?
the election.
That seems to me to be a normal function of the state. That does not seem to me to constitute a 5-year problem.
Right, but I'm talking about, like, if any institutional change were to be enacted, it would
Yeah.
happen after the election, I'm thinking.
Well, I think that the fact that that is currently the case right now is sort of a symptom of the fact that our system is not functioning the way that it was set up to function. Uh, um, you know, 250 years ago, or however long it was.
It's interesting because I guess I look at this far too simply, which is that you guys, North America is individualistic,
Yeah,
freedom to a fault,
yeah,
which means you have the freedom to get sick,
yeah.
right? And it's almost like with our system to maintain freedom, you have to let people walk into the word cloud of COVID if they want to.
I the reason why I disagree with that is that if you look at the 18th century, the concept of freedom that they were forming about the rights and the dignity of man was inherently different to just, I should fulfill my own will and do whatever I want. It came with a whole set of moral responsibilities and obligation, with the whole idea being that the concept of citizenship should uphold the good of the state. And because we've lost a concept of the common good right now, people say, well, it's freedom. I should do whatever I want. But from my interpretation of the texts, from my interpretation of what people said in those times, that's not what the original concept of freedom was. You know,
Well, it's interesting because I'm trying to think of, again, for better for worse, I did business in school. So I'm thinking about Adam Smith,
yeah,
right? And I'm
yeah,
thinking, yes, we have citizenship towards each other. At
yes.
the same time, the advocacy is for hyper selfishness with regards to, you know what I mean,
Well,
right?
no, this is really
Yeah.
interesting conversation. Like this is really because I have his book right over there, you
Wealth
know.
of Nations, yeah.
No, his other book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, that he wrote before he wrote Wealth of Nations.
Mm-hmm.
No one reads it. And it's the
Mm-hmm.
book he wrote where he lays out his whole theory of morality, which
Mm.
Wealth of Nations is actually built on. And
Nice.
I'm actually convinced one of the reasons why capitalism is really falling apart today is that no one has read the moral theory that
Okay.
is supposed to make the invisible hand make sense.
Ah,
That
tell
theory
me.
works. Well, he has this theory about how sympathy happens between different agents and what it is that causes some actions to be sympathetic and some actions not. And he basically builds up a theory of compassion that describes how compassion works in different situations. And he obviously wants to create a way to talk about a principle that I think is pretty common in our society, which is the idea that one person working for the betterment of themselves can have an indirectly good impact on the group. But along the way, he discusses things that are much more nuanced than the way we usually interpret that, just as pure selfishness. I think that if we change our idea of what fulfillment means for an agent, there might be a way that we could rehabilitate that system to be more effective in the 21st century. But the thing is that no one remembers that capitalism was originally built on a theory about compassion and about how we sympathize with each other. You know, that has been completely eradicated, interestingly enough.
How we sympathize with each other.
Yeah, he creates a theory of sympathy. It's quite like one of the first things he talks about is that, and this I think it really says a lot about why like homelessness is a problem is, you know, if someone is undergoing an emotional turmoil, right?
Mm-hmm.
If someone's sad, we automatically, even if we don't empathize with that person, we sympathize. I can't not feel your pain if I see you in pain. But if someone is starving, you do not feel sympathy. And if you reflect on this, you realize it's true.
That's
Just
tough.
seeing, you don't instantly feel the hunger of a person who's hungry. You feel the sadness of a person who's sad, but you don't feel the hunger of someone who's hungry. You
Yet
know?
anyone who's hungry would trade places with someone who's sad any given
Oh
day.
yeah, yeah, like in an instant, and it's far
You
worse.
would you would much rather have the operation work right the other way if you could
Yes,
trade that
yes.
response. That's so interesting. So if they were crying, they're more likely to be effective at attracting funding?
I mean, like, look at what happens in the world, right? Like, what are people willing to give charity to, right? What are people willing, people feel, it's natural to feel for someone who's sad. It's natural to want to feel for the Save the Children people who are coming around, the
Because
block.
hunger is not an emotion?
Yeah, basically, hunger is not an emotion. And he talks about other things too, though, how, like, if you watch someone's hand get cut off, right? You have an instant visceral
Yeah,
reaction.
you reach for your wrist.
Yes, you feel that, but you don't feel hunger. Hunger is one of the ones you don't feel. And it's,
How could you make someone feel hungry?
Right? I mean, I guess what they do, they do those ads where they show the picture of the children with the stomachs.
Yeah.
And that triggers like a maternal response in people. Like it's especially, I think, probably more with women than with men. You can't bear to not see the baby getting fed. That's the way that people.
A guy might just think of alimony. Yeah.
Right.
I'm just trying to think of like a Snickers ad.
Yeah, right. Yeah, okay. But then what's the Snickers ad, right? Like the Snickers ad is like all advertisement is like is trying to make the thing like the cult object, right?
Yeah.
Like you don't see what okay, let me ask you this. Okay.
Okay.
What candy bar ad has a hungry person in it? Right? Need a moment, chew it over in Twix. We never see, the guy's never hungry.
Mm-hmm.
Is he ever hungry?
How do you make someone feel hunger?
I mean, at least according to Adam Smith, you can't in the same way. So maybe
that's interesting.
He's
a pretty smart guy for seeing that.
Right. Yeah. Well, he did invent the economic system we're living in. So, but.
Or they did smuggle whatever they wanted through his idea.
Yeah. There was a little bit of that.
A little column A and column B.
Yeah. But
so, we have moral sentiments. That's really interesting.
Yeah. So there's like another side of the story with Adam Smith that I think like that's a reason why maybe we want to like change our economic system a bit to say, okay, maybe the market isn't actually going to be able to solve world hunger, right? Because you can't,
If I look at this concern through the eyes of a recruiter. That's what I do.
Yeah.
I've seen some really good AI. Right. And so I've always asked myself, even with my clients, how might I keep them relevant, first of all, because that's my job.
Yeah.
Right. But how long might I be able to keep them relevant?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like even now with like the dolphin-based AI that I tell people about, it's like when I see what it can do, it's like, whoa, guys, you have like, if you're just starting to look at this stuff, you should see what they were using 50 years ago to find oil.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like,
right.
What you see out there, I'm just going to disconnect this. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. It's almost like, let's not pretend that what you see in a blog has anything to do with reality.
Yeah, right.
Right? And it's weird because I think we have that expectation for that to be true. I see through the screen that I have has a semblance and a strong relationship to how things actually are.
Yeah.
But as a recruiter, as the dumb guy on the phone, I'm like, hold on, you can do what now?
Right.
Right? And that's like every conversation I have. Because I'm trying to find the guy who can do what now for my client.
Right.
Whether that's Java, or core Java, or serverless engineering, or Unity 3D, it's like, you talk to these guys and it's like, wow, I didn't realize that you were that far with it.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. That's interesting. We should probably, now is a probably good time to end off. I want to put on my glasses. It's recording, thank God. That was the only thing I was recording.
Still recording, yeah.
And I like where we ended off with it in terms of us talking like about how any idea of what it was, first of all, it wasn't.
Yeah.
Even if we're accurate, what generation were you accurate for?
Yeah, for
Because
sure.
in any generation, you have different. The Nile might have been different that year. The crop might have been different that year. There might have been a famine that year. There might have been a war that year. Maybe it's a decline. This is a pre-autumn, right? What is it?
Right.
And it's so weird because it's interesting because I guess the question is, we've experienced so much technological change that we look back on an Egyptian society and we look at society that's logically, technologically frozen in our minds.
Yeah.
Is that true?
I don't think so.
No.
Yeah.
And if they were technologically evolving, then who's to say that anyone's conception of what they thought is anyone close to? Who do
Well,
you think is closest to actually saying what it was like? Who's closest today, right now? Obviously, nobody's close because you're still writing, you're still publishing. If you thought somebody had it, you wouldn't keep writing.
yeah, I don't think that it's something that one person can get in a way, because it is such a long history, like you were just talking about. But one thing that Jan Osman has said that I think captures the relationship pretty well is that Europe is being haunted by Egypt. That's the relationship between the past of Egypt and European history, in that we've inherited all of these institutions and practices that we don't entirely understand. And there is a
Whoa.
sense in which the historical relationship is a haunting. We are being haunted by these people because we've almost taken over their culture in a way. So I think
But
that
we
part
don't
of,
have their religion.
yeah, we don't have their religion, so we're not doing it right. We're
We
doing it
don't have
way
the
wrong.
hardware. We have the software.
Exactly.
And
Yes.
it's like, no, dude, this shit was written in ternary. This is
Right.
binary, dude.
Right.
It's like we're using decimal, dude. This is base 60. Of course, this
Right.
shit doesn't compile.
Exactly. Exactly.
It's not to say it's not complete. We're
Yeah.
just compiling with the wrong compiler.
Exactly.
It's amazing when you say that, because in my first chat with Matthios, I think Durand said that philosophy is the end of religion, or marks the end of religion. And it's seen in the arts because the faith is the fuel of the arts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? And you can see that handoff between the
Yeah.
priest and the academic almost, or the philosopher.
It depends, but yes. Yes. There's a relationship in some ways. It is
So right now, it's weird because we have the ability to broadcast both the priest and the academic.
yeah, we're at a very interesting cultural moment. We're at a very, this is something is happening right now that's quite well, I don't know, every time is unique, right? But we're at a very interesting point at this exact juncture. So I don't know. I mean, it's tough. It's hard to see like what you can do, what is possible. But I do think that there is a potential at this moment for a great renaissance of all of the cultures of the world, all around the world, ultimately, and that
Well,
that's what we're going towards.
if I was going to end it off, where the start season 2 of the Just Out podcast started with fucking Fernando Castro Chavez. And he blew my mind because he was using the I Ching and the genetic code to solve obesity in mice. I'm like, whoa, you really operationalized this, eh? You're not just like making the connection and just like, no, you're seeing this with a microscope and you're putting the magnets on the cells and it's like, whoa. And again, he's as religious as you're gonna get.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Now, now I would put his level of biology against anyone. You want to do Jeopardy of biology? I'll put him up there with anyone. You know what I mean?
Yeah. For sure.
Now, but I would also put his biblical knowledge up there as well,
Right.
and his degree of devoutness.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because unless you met someone like that, you might just dismiss Christianity. But that guy's 10 times as scientific as I'm ever going to be, and
Right.
100 times more devout. And so,
Right.
what do you say to that person,
Right. Right.
right? Who's to say he's not seeing what he's seeing? You're not going to convince him.
Well, historically, the sciences were born in a moment where the church was being rebelled against. And that's sort of what, science outside of its older philosophical practices, science as we
Is
know.
that the two waves that crash?
Oh, I don't know. That's a beautiful way to think about it. Um, I have well, I do have some novels actually that if I do this class, if I have time, if we have
Yeah,
enough people who are interested, there are some stories that you can read that explore this moment when things flipped like that.
because I remember I was reading this book, The Big History of Ideas, and the book argued that Greece was the first time when they had that separation of church and science.
Uh,
That's what they were arguing, but this is a
yeah,
little book.
yeah. I think that's there's been a cult of the Greeks that has been built up in the past 200 years that gives that, not that they didn't have major cultural innovations and they contributed a great deal, but they are not the end all, they were not the end all be all of history. Even things that we call Western culture would have predated the Greeks, going back to Babylon and Egypt.
I still want to know who the African Euclid was.
Oh boy. Well, I mean, it really would be Imhotep. if it
Imhotep.
if it's anyone. I think I have I wrote about it on my blog. There is a paper that you can read about some of the constructions they were making at Saqqara,
Hmm.
where the step pyramid was built. So it's really, if it's anyone, it's Imhotep.
This is all agricultural driven, and or
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, they had agriculture. Yeah, there had been agriculture for like 2,000, 3,000 years beforehand.